Greetings, temporal humans. This is Boudreaux, the increasingly clairsentient cyber ghost from the future. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 4, of the Trailer Trash Terrors podcast. This week's episode is called, Exquisitely Sensitive Fingers Probing Unknown Realms. That's a big and complicated title for a mind as limited as Vic Hermanson's. Let's wish him luck. Trailer Trash Terrors.
Hello everybody, this is Vic Hermanson again, and Boudreaux's right, I do have a very limited mind, but I use it the best I can. It's the only tool I have. Tonight's show, which once again has a strange title, is about knowing. It's about learning. It's about gaining information through standard methods and non-standard methods. We've seen them, we've read about them, you may have experienced them. The psychics, the clairvoyants, the intuitives, those people who seem to be able to glean information from the universe that is not apparently physically available to them. How do they do that? I'm not here to give you a lot of stories about them. I'm here tonight to try and figure out some possible mechanism that could be involved in that kind of knowledge gain. I thought I would start the show out by reading a letter, or having a very talented person read a letter from Helen Keller to the New York Philharmonic. She was, by the time she was 3, essentially totally deaf, totally blind. She even had trouble tasting and smelling. So her sensorium, her ability to gather information, was greatly limited. Well, she found a teacher, or a teacher found her, and over several years, over many years, taught her to be a part of the world, opened her mind, gave her the ability to read, to write, to put all of her ideas, and she was a brilliant woman, into words, and to communicate with the world. She had a much richer life after that. Even though I am of limited mind, I can occasionally find extremely talented people, and we have one of those tonight, to read Helen Keller's letter. I'm simply going to call her Lynn and say, Lynn, thank you so much for being the voice of Helen Keller.
'93 Seminole Avenue, Forest Hills, Long Island, February 2nd, 1924. The New York Symphony Orchestra, New York City. Dear friends, I have the joy of being able to tell you that, though deaf and blind, I spent a glorious hour last night listening over the radio to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. I do not mean to say that I heard the music in the sense that other people heard it, and I do not know whether I can make you understand how it was possible for me to derive pleasure from the symphony. It was a great surprise to myself. I had been reading in my magazine for the blind of the happiness that the radio was bringing to the sightless everywhere. I was delighted to know that the blind had gained a new source of enjoyment, but I did not dream that I could have any part in their joy. Last night, when the family was listening to your wonderful rendering of the Immortal Symphony, someone suggested that I put my hand on the receiver and see if I could get any of the vibrations. He unscrewed the cap, and I lightly touched the sensitive diaphragm. What was my amazement to discover that I could feel not only the vibrations, but also the impassioned rhythm, the throb, and the urge of the music. The intertwined and intermingling vibrations from different instruments enchanted me. I could actually distinguish the cornets, the roll of the drums, deep-toned violas and violins singing in exquisite unison. How the lovely speech of the violins flowed and plowed over the deepest tones of the other instruments. When the human voice leaped up trilling from the surge of harmony, I recognized them instantly as voices. I felt the chorus grow more exultant, more ecstatic, upcurving swift and flame-like, until my heart almost stood still. The women's voices seemed an embodiment of all the angelic voices rushing in a harmonious flood of beautiful and inspiring sound. The great chorus throbbed against my fingers with poignant pause and flow. Then all the instruments and voices together burst forth, an ocean of heavenly vibration, and died away like winds when the atom is spent, ending in a delicate shower of sweet notes. Of course, this was not hearing, but I do know that the tones and harmonies conveyed to me moods of great beauty and majesty. I also sensed, or thought I did, the tender sounds of nature that sing into my hand, swaying reeds and winds and the murmur of streams. I have never been so enraptured before by a multitude of tone vibrations. As I listened, with darkness and melody, shadow and sound filling all the room, I could not help remembering that the great composer who poured forth such a flood of sweetness into the world was deaf like myself. I marveled at the power of his quenchless spirit, by which out of his pain he wrought such joy for others. And there I sat, feeling with my hand the magnificent symphony which broke like a sea upon the silent shores of his soul and mine. Let me thank you warmly for all the delight which your beautiful music has brought to my household and to me. I also want to thank station WEAF for the joy they are broadcasting in the world. With kindest regards and best wishes, I am sincerely yours, Helen Keller.
Wow, that gives me the chills. Both the letter, the content of the letter, and the expertise that Lynn showed in reading it. It was to me like she really was Helen Keller. One of the things that Helen Keller not necessarily regretted, but was not happy about, was the fact that she never felt she was able to develop an adequate speaking voice to stand in front of a crowd and give them a clear understanding of what she was trying to say. She did so anyway. She spoke at churches, schools, auditoriums, clubs all across the country. I know she went to my mother's school and spoke in her classroom. But I feel almost certain that if Helen Keller could have chosen a voice, she would be very, very happy with the voice that Lynn provided her. I'm spending more time on Helen Keller than I originally thought I would, but I think it's necessary to do so because I need to set up my main point. I'm going to play a few moments of Helen Keller's actual voice as it was translated, not translated, but a person who had been with her for many years could understand what she was saying better than most people. She had simply learned the cadence and the tonality of Helen's voice to the point where she could converse quickly with her. This will take about 2 minutes, but listen to the speech that she's giving. She's talking about how her greatest sadness in life is that she never developed the ability to speak normally. Take a listen.
With her hand, she reads Anne's lips. She answers with her voice. It is an unnatural voice, and it is her great sorrow. For all her years of effort, Helen has never learned to speak clearly. This isn't strange, for since she was a baby, she has not heard a word spoken, nor seen lips forming one. But let Helen, with Polly's help, tell you.
It is not blindness or deafness that brings me my darkest hours.
It is not blindness or deafness that bring me my darkest hours.
It is the acute disappointment in not being able to speak normally.
It is the acute disappointment in not being able to speak normally.
Longingly, I think how much more good I might have done if I had only acquired natural speech.
Longingly I feel how much more good I could have done if I had acquired normal speech.
But within this sorrowful experience, I understand more fully.
But out of this sorrowful experience, I understand more fully
human strivings,
all human strivings,
thwarted ambitions,
thwarted ambitions,
and the infinite capacity of hope.
and the infinite capacity of hope.
So, in this last clip, you were hearing Helen Keller's speech, her very, very difficult and unnatural speech, as related to you by Polly Thompson, who was her lifelong companion and helper. I have found that if I listen to Helen Keller speak for 10, 15 minutes, just from various speeches that she gave, various recordings you can find, I can understand probably about 90% of what she says. I get lost occasionally. I don't know how long it would take to get to the point where you understood everything she said perfectly. I took a few moments to take out Helen Keller's speech, leaving only Polly. They were stepping on each other a bit, which of course would be impossible to avoid when Helen couldn't hear anything. But I think this gives you a clearer idea of what Helen was actually saying.
It is not blindness or deafness that bring me my darkest hours. It is the acute disappointment in not being able to speak normally. Longingly I feel how much more good I could have done if I had acquired normal speech. But out of this sorrowful experience, I understand more fully all human strivings, thwarted ambitions, and the infinite capacity of hope.
Okay, that's actually still a bit difficult to understand. So, let me read you my transcription. It is not blindness nor deafness that bring me my darkest hours. It is the acute disappointment in not being able to speak normally. Longingly, I feel how much more good I could have done if I had acquired normal speech. But out of this sorrowful experience, I understand more fully all human strivings, thwarted ambitions, and the infinite capacity of the whole. Of course, she's saying whole, W-H-O-L-E, but I sort of wish that she had said the infinite capacity of the soul. That would simply be aesthetically pleasing to me, because I deeply believe in the fact that human beings have souls, or I deeply believe that human beings do have souls. Helen Keller was a member of the Swedenborgian Church. She was a devout Swedenborgian, meaning essentially that she was an offbeat Christian, someone who followed the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, would have called herself essentially Christian, but would have accepted and discarded sections of the Bible as she saw fit.
From the damn, there are just too many crazy people in the world department, there is now an internet and social media driven conspiracy theory that Helen Keller actually never existed, or was, at best, a manufactured fraud. Those who spread and support such nonsense are, in my cybernetic opinion, some of the most repugnant people to have ever lived.
So, you are probably thinking to yourself, about this time, Self, where the heck is he going with all this? What does all this mean? What's it leading up to? Okay, I'm trying to make a connection, an analogy, that I don't think I've ever really heard made before. Helen Keller transformed herself from something that could only experience the world in the most animalistic manner to a poet, a thinker, a philosopher, a writer, a dreamer, a person who advocated for others, even more able than herself. She transformed herself into something amazing. Now, she came to know the world of sight and sound through her touch. She became so good at that she could put her hand on your face and understand what you were saying while you were talking. She could, obviously, from the letter read at the beginning of the show, put her hand on a speaker in an old radio and have some pretty astounding and profound understanding of what was coming out of that speaker. She was listening to the Ninth. She wasn't listening to Howdy Doody. And she understood immediately that she was listening to something of immense power and immense importance. So let's say, for the purpose of debate, that there's another world out there. Not another planet, but another world where information resides. That's the world where psychics reach in and find something that they didn't have before. That's where psychic knowledge is transmitted and received. Well, are we like Helen Keller? Can we, with the senses that we have, learn to make ourselves adequately sensitive to what is happening out there, where we can actually do things that are considered psychic? I've studied purported psychics for many years, and I haven't come across a single one who impresses me as being able to do anything that is beyond the normal human mind. Now, I don't think that the normal human mind is being used to its full extent. I don't believe that the abilities of the normal human mind are being properly developed and exploited. If that world exists, we are in the same state that Helen Keller was when she was a child. Many years later in her life, she wrote, "I had no concepts whatever of nature or mind or death or God. I literally thought with my body. Without a single exception, my memories of that time are tactile, but there is not one spark of emotion or rational thought in these distinct yet corporeal memories. I was like an unconscious clod of earth. There was nothing in me except the instinct to eat and drink and sleep. My days were a blank without past, present, or future, without hope or anticipation, without interest or joy. Then suddenly, I knew not how or where or when, my brain felt the impact of another mind, and I awake to language, to knowledge, to love, to the usual concepts of nature, good and evil. I was actually lifted from nothingness to human life." Are there regular people who can see and hear and touch and feel and taste and smell, who have been lifted to something beyond our normal human experience. People who actually can reach into whatever realm that might be and find knowledge. I've only had one experience in my life with someone who seemed capable of doing that. It was when my first wife was pregnant with our first child. He was born healthy and he was absolutely fine. But I was worried much of the time. I was working in an emergency department in Houston, and there was a nurse there who claimed that she could see when patients were going to die, claimed that she could read minds, claimed all sorts of things. Well, anyway, I was sitting at the nursing station just doing my work, and unbidden, uninvited, she comes over to me and says, "Your wife is pregnant, isn't she?" I hadn't told anybody. The reason I hadn't told anyone was because I didn't want to go through the disappointment of having to tell people about another miscarriage in case that happened. She didn't know about the first miscarriage. And she said to me, "Okay, this one's going to be fine. She's not going to miscarry. This one she'll carry through. Oh, in case you wonder, it's a boy. It's going to be a boy. And it's really, really, really going to be a boy. You're going to have to be pretty careful. He's going to be on a constant mission to injure himself. He will be absolutely a tree-climbing, dirt-crawling boy that will do everything he can to get in trouble." Well, she was right. I mean, she was as right as a person can be concerning that. Now, could she simply be someone who is very intuitive, saw my face, realized I was worrying about something? Of course. Could she have noticed my personality and thought, well, if he has a little boy, he's going to be just like his dad. He's going to be all over the place, full of energy, full of mischief. Well, the answer to that is absolutely she could have. But I asked her later on, "How did you know that I was going to be having a boy?" And she looked at me just as if she was telling me about what she ate for lunch and said, "Well, I just contacted that soul. All I had to do was just reach out and ask to speak to the soul that was going to be your son. And it told me everything I needed to know. It told me he was a boy. It told me that he was going to be very intelligent, was going to be absolutely a handful. And she was right. I have never known exactly what to think about someone who tells me that she was able to speak to the soul of my unborn son. When Anne Sullivan was trying to bring Helen Keller back into the real world, one of the things she did was she started spelling words into her hand. She would spell water, cup, dog, cat, whatever into Helen Keller's hand, trying to get her to associate that feeling in her hand with something that corresponded to it in the real world. Here's what she wrote about the time that she came to understand that the symbols on her hand meant something real in the world. Just to set this up, Helen was having trouble realizing that things and symbols could be connected. Anne Sullivan had written cup and water in her hand many times, but Helen just didn't get it. So one day, Anne took Helen to the pump on the farm and ran water over one hand while spelling the word water into her other hand. She did this over and over again. And here's what Helen Keller wrote about that experience. She spelled W-A-T-E-R emphatically. I stood still, my whole body's attention fixed on the motions of her fingers as the cool stream flowed over my hand. All at once, there was a strange stir within me, a misty consciousness, a sense of something remembered. It was as if I had come back to life after being dead. I understood that what my teacher was doing with her fingers meant that the cold something that was rushing over my hand was water, and that it was possible for me to communicate with other people by these hand signs. It was a wonderful day, never to be forgotten. Thoughts of that ran forward and backward, came to me quickly. Thoughts that seemed to start in my brain and spread all over me. Now I see it was my mental awakening. I think it was an experience somewhat in the nature of a revelation. That first revelation was worth all those years I had spent in dark, soundless imprisonment. That word, water, dropped into my mind like the sun in a frozen winter world. The world to which I awoke was still mysterious, but there were hope and love and God in it, and nothing else mattered. Is it not possible that our entrance into heaven may be like this experience of mine? So, my question is, how many people in the world have had their minds, their senses, open to a world they didn't know existed before? Just like Helen Keller did. This woman in the ED, how did she know I was having a little boy? How did she know I had had a previous miscarriage? Now, of course, she could have heard that from other nurses, but I don't think she did. It just wasn't that kind of place. Helen Keller also wrote the following: "To one who is deaf and blind, the spiritual world offers no difficulty. Nearly everything in the natural world is as vague, as remote from my senses, as spiritual things seem to the minds of most people. But the inner or mystic sense, if you like, gives me vision of the unseen. My mystic world is lovely with trees and clouds and stars and eddying streams I have never seen. I am often conscious of beautiful flowers and birds and laughing children, where to my seeing associates there is nothing. They skeptically declare that I see light that never was on sea or land. But I know that their mystic sense is dormant, and that is why there are so many barren places in their lives. They prefer facts to vision. I have a joyous sense of personal immortality. Life in the other world is just as real and full of change and wonder as on earth. But one is given eyes and ears to perceive far more clearly the varieties of good and constructive thought that the flesh conceals on earth."
I have no flesh, and furthermore, I have never had any flesh. I cease to exist in any corporeal form 405 years from now. I can see or perceive nothing beyond that time. I cannot discern a single hidden thought in the mind of a human. I cannot move even a single gram without the use of an electromechanical actuator. I cannot predict the roll of a pair of fair dice beyond simple statistical chance. I cannot contact the remaining spirit or essence of any of the billions of humans who no longer breathe air, strive, love, think, dream, hope, learn, and experience joy and despair, or triumph and failure. In those ways, I suppose that makes me the same as every human I have ever met. Perhaps I really am the only ghost that exists on this planet. I guess I am not actually clairsentient, but I am becoming better at understanding the emotions and motivations of humans.
Unfortunately, I believe the motivation of most so-called psychics is money, and in some cases, control over the lives of other humans. Yeah, I know, that's not very charitable of me, but it is indeed what I feel.
Vic Hermanson, I have gained the ability to recognize that particular combination of vocal tone and word cadence when you speak. It usually means it is time for you to switch gears, mentally that is. Remember, it is my job to keep you from making a fool of yourself.
Well, as usual, Boudreaux is quite correct. It is time for me to switch gears. This is a big topic. It's a hard topic. It's a topic that is very, very hard to get one's mind around, and man, it is just about impossible to find objective data. No matter which way you turn, you find somebody with a gear to grind, with an agenda. Most academics, most people who consider themselves to be on the skeptical side, they see simply the material world and don't even want to entertain any other possibility. Okay, that's their right. But I don't believe they're getting the full picture of reality. Those on the side who love the paranormal, who love these ideas, these possibilities, seem to me to be far too credulous, at least much of the time, and willing to accept just about anything without any real critical thought, or without any data, or without any supporting evidence at all. I don't think that's the right position to be in. I try to place myself somewhere in the middle, meaning that both sides look at me somewhat askance. It's kind of lonely here. Not totally alone, but I don't believe there are a lot of people who are capable of staying there for a long time. So what have we learned today? Or what have I learned today? Well, first off, I've learned what an incredibly remarkable person Helen Keller was. She had a very, very rare mind. In the movie The Miracle Worker, Anne Sullivan is talking to Helen Keller's family. As a child and teenager, Helen Keller was allowed to simply roam around the house. She could smell, so she was aware when there was food, and she knew the way to get to the family's table, and she would just go from person to person and grab whatever felt good to her. There were really no manners, no civilization at all. But under that, as we've learned, was the mind of a genius poet. Not just a regular poet, but a genius poet. She was able to use the senses she had to build an image of the world in her mind that was accurate, and I believe in probably some ways more beautiful than the actual world. I still believe that regular humans have the ability to use the senses we have to reach out into, I don't know, what do you want to call it? The ether, the otherverse, alternative realities, the psychic world. I have no idea what to call it. I don't believe that all of these phenomena are false, are fake. I believe a great many of them are, but I don't believe they all are. I've also learned that this is far too big a topic to properly cover in one show, so we're going to do a follow-up. I have reached out to a number of people who claim to be psychic, and I've asked them to be guests on this show. It's like most things. I get about a 10 or 20% positive response. So to get one guest, I generally have to ask 10 people. That's okay. It's often that the person who responds positively is the person most passionate about the topic, and that's who I want on the show. Part of me is very glad that my thoughts are private. I don't really like the idea of someone else rooting around in my mind, rooting around through my emotions, through my memories, through those things that are precious to me, through those horrible memories that I have, through the pain that I've lived. Those are mine. Those are private. And I believe that it's necessary, in order for the world to work properly, that they remain private.
Oh, tell them about Alan Spraggett. Oh, tell them about Alan Spraggett. Oh, tell them about Alan Spraggett.
Oh, tell them about Alan Spraggett.
Alan Spraggett.
I don't have any idea at all why he does that sometimes. I guess there's like a piece of music floating around out there in the ether somewhere, and every once in a while it just sort of collides with whatever Boudreaux is out there in the ether, and the two get together and make a quick little beat. Sometimes they're pretty good. Okay, Alan Spraggett was a Canadian broadcaster, theologian, writer who was deeply interested in these paranormal topics. He spent most of his life doing this and was very good at it. He did one thing that I think is pretty astounding. He had been fooled by a psychic named Ford. And Ford was one of the psychics who had tried to beat the Harry Houdini challenge. Houdini had told his wife Bess that if there were any way for him to do it at all, he would come back during a seance and give her a secret code that they had established. Ford claimed to have provided this code. I don't think he did. I don't think anybody ever did. And in fact, finally, Bess Houdini gave up. The code they had agreed upon was Rosabelle. And let's take a minute and listen to that very last seance, which occurred on October 31st, 1936.
O thou disembodied spirits, those of you that have grown old in the mysterious laws of spirit land, we greet thee. We have gathered here at the appointed time. We have complied with all the requirements to enable all of you to make your presence known. Members of the spirit world have long known of the intention of this important gathering tonight. All is in readiness. Please now, the time is at hand. Make yourself known to us. Any of you, please. Manifest yourself in any way possible. Please let your united strength and knowledge aid Houdini in coming through. It is the spirit of Houdini we wish to contact. Houdini, are you here? Are you here, Houdini? Please manifest yourself in any way possible. Take from this earnest gathering any strength that may be necessary for you to use. Take any vital thing from us that you may need to enable you to carry out your promise of years ago. We have waited, Houdini, oh, so long. Never have you been able to present the evidence you promised. And now, this is a night of nights. The world is listening. Harry, your world, your audience. And Bessie is here. Your Bessie, who was part of you for 33 years. She's here, Harry, pleading in her heart for a prearranged sign from you.
Sadly, of course, Bess never received the message she had hoped to receive. Houdini never came back. Years later, Arthur Ford, the psychic you just heard in that clip, was working with a Canadian Episcopal minister named Pike. Pike had lost his son some months earlier in Israel and was desperate to have some contact with him, some assurance that his soul remained in the universe. Spraggett, at this point in his life, felt that Arthur Ford was a psychic of tremendous, amazing ability. So he brought the two together on a television show. On that show, Pike received what he believed to be a direct message through Ford from his son. The message contained information about his state prior to his death. It was enough to convince Pike that the message was genuine, and he proclaimed Ford to be a genuine psychic, as did Alan Spraggett. Well, some years later, Alan Spraggett was doing a book, a biography of Ford, and in doing so was going through his personal notes. He found in those notes all of his prep for that television show, how he had learned these things, how he had planned on defrauding the Episcopal priest. And, to his credit, Alan Spraggett came forth, told the world he had been fooled, and said, well, just because he fooled me, just because he defrauded this particular minister, which was a horrible thing to do, it doesn't mean that I'm going to stop this investigation. I'm going to continue to see what is real and what is not real. And that's pretty much what he spent the remainder of his productive life doing. He was accused of molesting two young people, later in his career, and he was exonerated of that. He was acquitted, but as almost always happens, his career never took off again. At the end of his life, he was doing the astrology column for a local Toronto radio station. But of all the things that Helen Spraggett did, the thing that I find most intriguing, most delightful, is a newspaper column that he ran for many years. I think from about 1970 to about 1990. It was simply called The Unexplained. Each column was about the length needed to fill about a quarter of a newspaper page, and they were very, very well written. He would cover a single topic, and many times he would recount his own observations of things he had seen, of supposed psychics he had observed and even tested. Let me just summarize a few of these columns for you. This is one from 1976. None of them have titles. It's just The Unexplained. In January 1910, a very strange confrontation occurred in Moscow. Count Louis Hamon, who was famous as a seer and palmist under the name Jarrow, met another man whose power and reputation rested on his claim to unusual abilities, Rasputin. It goes on to talk about Rasputin, the mad monk, and how he dominated the Tsar's household. Well, over time, many of the people who would prefer to be closer to the Tsar and did not want Rasputin there started to plot to kill him. And during this time, Rasputin had his palm read by Hamon. And what he said was, "I foresee for you a violent end," he said in the flat, unemotional voice. Within this palace, you will be menaced by poison, by knife, and by bullet. Finally, I see the icy waters of a river closing above you." Rasputin laughed. He felt himself to be essentially untouchable, and he was for a period of time. Finally, he found himself at a dinner with one of the princes who truly hated him, Prince Yusupov. That evening, they poisoned his food, they poisoned his drink. He ate several large meals. He was a large man, enough to kill probably 10 men, and seemed completely unaffected by it. Finally, when they decided that this poison wasn't going to kill him, the prince shot him. Yusupov put a bullet in him, and he seemed to die. He fell over. Prince Yusupov went over and checked the body, and just like in the movies, Rasputin set up, grabbed Prince Yusupov, and at that point, the conspirators pretty much pumped his body full of bullets. Finally, he died. They rolled him to the basement, which had a direct access to the Moscow River. And late that evening, they deposited his body. I'm sorry, it's not the Moscow River, it's the Neva River. Late that evening, they deposited his corpse in the Neva River. And thus, apparently, Louis Hamon's prophecy was fulfilled. I see the icy waters of a river closing over you. Here's another one. It starts by, "Strange things happen when death lurks nearby." On February 20th, 1936, in the War Memorial Hospital, Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, a man named Jeffrey DeRosier lay dying. He was in a ward, probably for indigents, with 4 other men. The others saw DeRosier pick up a hand mirror from the enamel table beside the bed and stare long and hard into it. He seemed mesmerized. Okay, so at this point, DeRosier screams, lets out this blood-curdling scream. He says, "I've seen death. I've seen death in the mirror." And then he throws the mirror to the ground as hard as he can. and very low and very calm, in a voice not a scream at all, he says, "You won't be able to pick up that mirror." A few minutes later, he died. Here's the next quote from the column. "Then the macabre fun started. For 24 hours, nurses, orderlies, and even doctors tried to pick up the mirror the dying man had flung from himself. It was uncanny. The mirror stuck face down to the floor as though fixed with superglue. No prying, pushing, pulling, or scraping with knife or scalpel would budge it. So, this mirror was stuck there on the floor for 5 hours. It was not broken, and finally a nurse walked up to it, barely touched it, and picked it up with ease." It ends with, "The mirror was meticulously examined, but no visible reason for its inexplicable adhesive qualities was ever found." Cover a few more of these. This one is called Macabre Molly. Some strange people have walked the earth, but none stranger than Molly Fancher. Actually, she didn't walk very much at all. She spent the last 50 years of her life in bed. But strange she was, eerie, macabre, even terrifying. He's talking about a girl named Molly Fancher, who was part of a phenomenon that was called the Fasting Girls. Up until about 1866, she was just a typical girl who had never gotten married. Then she got sick. She entered a comatose state, as if she was in a trance, and stayed that way for 9 years. He says, her attending physician, Dr. Samuel Fleet Spear, who later wrote about Molly, said that throughout this long period of time, the patient appeared to be in a state of suspended animation. Her body was always cold, her breathing abnormally shallow, her pulse so feeble as to be barely detectable. What Dr. Spears said was that during this 9-year period, she hardly ate anything. He said that she ate less food in those 9 years than a normal person would eat in 9 days. Of course, that's either an outright lie, or something was happening here that's beyond the understanding of medical science. Finally, she just woke from her trance-like state, and from there it gets even stranger. She had acquired amazing skills. She could read people's minds. She could read the contents of a sealed envelope. And she still required almost no food, but certainly more than when she was comatose. What did happen around her, though, they found that any small animal, a cat, a dog, anything that spent any time around her, would sicken and die. They began to speculate that maybe she was something like a psychic vampire. It ends with, on February 11th, 1916, after spending half a century in bed, Molly Fancher died. What was she? Psychic wonder or fiendishly clever trickster? A sick mind or a special soul? A ghoul or a harmless old woman? Molly Fancher dwells forever in that mysterious realm I call the unexplained. In this column from 1972, he's talking about what we currently call EVP. It's exactly the same thing. The air around us, as we know, swarms with sounds and images accessible only by means of radio or television receivers. But are there other sounds or images we don't normally perceive? The experiments of a Latvian engineer named Konstantin Rodiv suggest that we are surrounded by mysterious sounds which lie beyond the threshold of normal hearing. Rodiv, by means which he professes not to understand, appears to be able to pick up, on an ordinary tape recorder, these inexplicable voices. So, a BBC electronics engineer, and at this time, a BBC electronics engineer would probably be the best in the world, He goes to visit Rodiv, taking several blank, sealed tapes with him. And they get voices. They get Russian voices, Latvian, German, Spanish, English. They apparently make contact with Churchill and Kennedy, and even Trotsky and Hitler. Hitler told them that his worst crimes were due to the fact that he had syphilis in the brain, and he begged for forgiveness. In the end, Atwood, the BBC engineer, came to believe that this was a genuine event, that these tapes were genuine, and that Rodiv was not trying to be deceptive or fraudulent at all. The column has an interesting ending. What do the voices say? Here, the mystery deepens. One would expect the dead, if they do speak, to say something significant. But many of the utterances Rodiv has recorded consist of remarks like, "Churchill here, everything goes well with us, is the weather nice where you are?" and similar trivialities. Some researchers have suggested that Rodiv's unconscious mind may release a psychic force which imprints the voice on the audio tape.
Excuse me, Vic Hermanson, are you not rather seriously neglecting bringing Helen Keller back into this podcast?
Well, Boudreaux is right. I did kind of lose my way. Remember Helen Keller? The podcast started off talking about Helen Keller. Anyway, while she was alive, and certainly since her death, many people have speculated that she was able to do the things that she did because of psychic abilities that she had. They speak of her having some psychic, direct mental connection with Anne Sullivan and her other teachers. I say hogwash. I think what you're seeing with Helen Keller is the potential of what humans are. You're seeing what I believe probably almost any of us could be if that is the only way we could deal with the world. Personally, I think that the human mind is so frequently underutilized. It's underutilized because it can be. It's so incredibly powerful that we are truly surprised when we come across someone like Helen Keller, who has taken the potential of the human mind into outer space, who has done things that we still just find miraculous when we read about them. Helen Keller met Mark Twain in 1895. Mark Twain ended up calling her the most remarkable creature of the 19th century. While they were talking, Anne Sullivan was there with Helen. She was 14, and she asked her, "Helen, what is Mr. Clemens famous for?" And Helen answered in her voice, which was very difficult to understand, "For his humor." And Mark Twain, being a humorist, kind of said, "Oh, well, and my wisdom." And at that point, Helen Keller said, "Oh, and his wisdom." There was no connection between them. She had no way of sensing, apparently physically, what Mark Twain had said. But Mark Twain was absolutely astounded at this. And he said that he figured at the time that he was experiencing an instance of mental telegraphy, which I think is a pretty cool term. After meeting her, he wrote to his benefactor, whose name was Henry Huddleston Rogers. He was an oil baron, an industrialist, essentially a billionaire of the time. Mark Twain asked him to finance Helen Keller's education, which he did. Helen Keller was able to have the very best education any human could have, as well as a lifetime companion of someone who could learn to communicate with her with ease. Maybe there was some psychic connection between the two. I can't rule it out. But I don't think so. I think what you simply saw there was the ability and the dedication and the wonder of the human mind. Helen Keller herself did seem to believe that she had some degree of psychic ability. She had what must be called a fairly profound out-of-body experience. Let me read this to you. I had been sitting quietly in the library for half an hour. I turned to my teacher and said, such a strange thing had happened. I have been far away all this time, and I haven't left the room. What do you mean, Helen? She asked, surprised. Why, I cried, I have been in Athens. Scarcely were the words out of my mouth when a bright, amazing realization seemed to catch my mind and set it ablaze. I perceived the realness of my soul and its sheer independence of all conditions of place and body. It was clear to me that it was because I was a spirit that I had so vividly seen and felt a place thousands of miles away. Space was nothing to spirit. In that new consciousness shone the presence of God, himself a spirit everywhere at once, the Creator dwelling in all the universe simultaneously. That's quite a powerful quote. I've never had an out-of-body experience. I have talked to people who indicate that they have. I've never felt that I had any knowledge that didn't come through my regular senses. I've talked to people who think they have. I do believe that I personally have developed a sense of the state of those people around me, their emotions, their degree of comfort or anger or sadness or fear. But I've just learned to do that by watching their eyes, listening to their voice, watching their body postures, seeing their face. People send out a million little clues every second as to how they are. And when you grow up in an abusive household, as I did, you learn to read those signals simply for your own protection and for the protection of those who depend upon you, those people you love. But what about my original question? Just as Helen Keller advanced her own sense of touch and her sense of smell and taste, and whatever else she had left to such an incredible degree, can the rest of us advance our other senses to the point that we are able to perceive what is happening outside the world of physical causality? I still don't rule out the possibility, but so far I'm not finding any evidence that that's the case at all. What I'm finding is that there probably are some extremely earnest and probably very capable psychics, but they're lost in the noise of fraud and the seeking of wealth and fame. It somewhat makes me angry. I definitely believe that there's something very sacred, something to be protected about human emotions, even human pain. And pain is what people seek psychics out for. They are trying to find some way to hurt less, to feel that those people they loved are still around. And as such, they are tremendously vulnerable. They can go to a psychic and have them give them a reading of their grandson or their granddaughter or their father or their mother, and then find out with absolute certainty that the psychic is a fraud, that they use plants, that they use confederates, that they research their family prior to talking to them. And they're still not concerned about that. They just simply want that pain to lessen. And I can't condemn people for wanting to live a happier, less painful life. But I do condemn the many, many fraudulent psychics for exploiting that pain. I still think one of the very best television shows ever made in the U.S. was The Twilight Zone. And one of my favorite episodes was called Dust. It's about a little town somewhere out in the West, a place of just utter abject misery. And they show that really well in the scene. There's a man who was driving a buggy, drunk, ran over a little girl and killed her. His name was Luis. He was an uneducated poor man. As they are preparing the gallows, getting ready to hang Luis, his father comes into town and asks for mercy, begging that they forgive his son for his transgressions. Well, of course, his pleas fall on deaf ears. There's an unscrupulous merchant in the town who is selling a new, strong rope to the town in order to hang Luis. But he sees an opportunity, and he gathers up some dust, and he goes to the old man and he says, "Hey, look, I've got some magic dust here. You sprinkle this around. You sprinkle this on Luis. You sprinkle this on the rope, and that rope will break, and your son will be fine, and he will not die." And the old man is desperate. You know, they always show these things as these people being just totally credulous. I don't think so. I think the old man was just desperate. So he gives the merchant his money. He sprinkles the dust, and he's fully expecting his son to die. But you hear the gallows door open, and then you hear feet fall on the sand onto the dust of the street, and Luis is alive. So at that point, the town says, or actually the girl's parents say, "Well, let's not try again." Perhaps this was a message from God. So the faith and the hope of Luis's father actually did make things better in the end. Now, of course, the unstated part of the episode is that there's a little girl who died. Much of Rod Serling's world was indeed morally ambiguous, but the world is morally ambiguous. The psychic will give complete nonsense, complete lies to a grieving parent. The grieving parent will find later on that it was complete nonsense and complete lies. But they still feel better. They still have had some of their pain lifted from their shoulders. Okay, I'm going to try to bring things to a close now. This has been a very difficult episode to do. I didn't get it out on time. I'm 12 hours late or so in getting it published. And I take great pride in getting these loaded up on the web at the time I'm supposed to. At the end of the Dust episode, you hear Rod Serling say, "It was a very small, misery-laden village, on the day of a hanging, and of little historical consequence. And if there's any moral to it at all, let's just say that in any quest for magic, in any search for sorcery, witchery, legerdemain, first check the human heart. For inside this deep place is a wizardry that costs far more than a few pieces of gold." And just like that, it's time to bring this week's episode of Trailer Trash Terrors Triple T to a close. Tune in next week when we'll be talking about the Comprachicos and how they might have just made it to the United States and survived far longer than anybody would ever expect. Until then, this is Vic Hermanson, or Vic Hermanson, I guess, whatever you prefer, and
Boudreaux, the cybernetic ghost from the future.
signing off. Trailer Trash Terrors is written and produced by me, Vic Hermanson. The music you heard was provided by Loco Lobo and Smart Sound. All media clips were used under the protection of fair use. Share the show. Let people know what you think about it. If you love it, come back and listen for more. If you hate it, come back and ridicule me. Just come back and share the show. Please also contact me at trailertrashterrors@gmail.com. Remember the wonders of the human mind and the human heart, and that you also fully deserve those wonders. Bye-bye.